So let's get started. I mentioned that the reason we're all here is to discuss how you can outsmart cyber criminals with cutting-edge defences. And we have the opportunity to hear from Don Smith, Vice President of Threat Research at SecureWorks. So let's bring Dom onto the stage to outline all the big challenges, all the big threats. Hello to you, Don. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Yes, thank you for such a nice welcome.
Absolutely. And you're diving straight into the deep end, starting us all in this very great event. 5 hours of fantastic content, and I know you've got plenty to say. I can see that your presentation is up on the stage. So I think we just need to get straight down to business, and I'll give you the floor.
Cool, thank you very much. And before I head into my presentation, just one other quick housekeeping note. There's an extra 1,000 or so challenges about to be dropped into the CTF. So for those of you who are participating in the Capture the Flag challenge, you can head over there at your leisure and try and pick up some further points. So, let's talk about the threat. I've been doing this for a very long time, since a hack at university in Scotland back in 1993. And in the last 30 years, I think the landscape has very much been characterised by an evolution of threat actors. Back at that time, people were hacking into computers just to look around and explore. Then the virus writers started to sort of tag themselves and try and create reputations. Then around 2007, 2008, the Eastern European criminal fraternity realised they could make money out of a network intrusion, and since then we've had the rise of hacktivists, nation-state actors and spooks. So all these different threat actors. So how do we define a threat? So a threat is a combination of the intent of these various different types of threat actors, the capability, the means with which they can carry out their threat, and the opportunity that opportunities present themselves to conduct their nefarious activities. And we see kind of 4 principal intents. You could argue there's a little bit more, but there's basically stealing money, stealing ideas, temporary disruption, or somewhat more permanent disruption. And because it's essentially untargeted, and I'll come back to that later in my presentation, I'll start off and I'll focus on money making, on sophisticated criminal enterprises and what they're doing to extract cash in various forms from people all over the globe. And it won't be any surprise to any of you that ransomware is a real focus. And I guess the question is, how did we get here in terms of ransomware? And I think it's useful to think about bad guys landing on a network. They've got a network intrusion and they're considering how best to monetize it, how best to get a return on investment from that little foothold they've got into somebody's organization somewhere. And that's what we've seen over the last 15 years. We've gone from banking trojans that target individuals to single host ransomware with CryptoLocker and CryptoWall and all these guys 7 or 8 or 10 years ago. Then we had an evolution towards other forms of funds transfer, targeting banking trojans, targeting business banking, and then of course finally we've got ransomware, total network encryption, then coupled with various different forms of name and shame tactics to extract a payout from a victim. But all this is sophisticated criminal enterprises trying to maximize their return on investment on a network intrusion. Our annual threat report is published today, I think, for people who've attended the conference, and later on in the week for others. I guess the one slightly disturbing statistic for me from our report this year is that the median dwell time for ransomware from initial network intrusion to the encryption event in the network has dropped to just under 24 hours. And the median is a pretty stable estimate of location compared to the mean. I think last year it was 4.5 days was the median. The year before it was 5 or 5.5. So we suddenly had this collapse down to under 24 hours. And under 24 hours is a less comfortable time to observe ransomware precursors in your environment than perhaps many of us would like. So that's a significant worry and a significant concern for network defenders. I would say, though, that the incident complexity is very different, and these things are probably coupled. It's been a long time since I've seen an absolutely disastrous multi-site enterprise takedown where every site in their wide area network was disrupted, that they lost all their voice services and everything else. The ransomware gangs, The dwell time shortening is there because they're pretty much landing where they land and encrypting what they see and getting out quickly. So there is a kind of an upside there in that the big game ransomware incidents of the past, they still make the headlines, but we're not seeing entire enterprise annihilations like we were 3 or 4 years ago. Now, in the content that's coming in, 2 of the live sessions are focused on ransomware, so Gold Tahoe, Clop, and then Chinese ransomware gangs. So Keith and Mark are covering that. We've also got 4 on-demand sessions on ransomware. We've got an overview of the ransomware landscape and 3 different playbooks from 3 different ransomware actors. So it's going to be covered by Tim, Aidan, and Keith. But I do have just a couple of things to drill into myself. This is a confusing diagram. It's a stacked bar diagram. It's leak site data, and the colors represent different threat groups. You can see broadly there's a trend to say, hey, there's more data appearing in leak sites. I think we just passed the 10,000th victim on a leak site. But what you can highlight here is that kind of bluey color, if it's coming through in your monitor, the same color as me, which kind of peters out halfway through the graph at the bottom there. That's Conti, and everyone knows about Conti leaks. Then the light blue, the cyan, if any of you is a ZX Spectrum fan, that's Lockbit, and obviously their affiliate model and the methods they use to scale with almost complete delegation to affiliates, making them big and successful. Then you can see Gold Tahoe, in our language, Clop, with the 3 big magenta lines corresponding to the compromise, the 0 days, and the file transfer appliances. And also interesting, the kind of red spike 3 months ago, which is Malice Locker with a 0 day and Zimbra. So it's just interesting to see that we've got, like any kind of relatively mature landscape, we've got a few big players, and then we've got shrapnel. We've got a sort of just a complete diversity of playbooks and behaviors, new entrants constantly, which makes things obviously difficult for network defenders. I think the last thing I would say on this slide is it is easy to kind of fuzz your eyes and do a trend line here and say, oh, look, this is actually getting worse. You could do a couple of things. You could take out the big one-off events like the Clop stuff and Malice Locker, and it wouldn't look quite the same, but it would still possibly be trending upwards. Obviously, this is an aperture, and the aperture may be biased by other things. What if, for example, less people are paying the ransom? That would mean that even if the system was static, you'd see more people appearing on the leak site. So as ever, with any of these trend lines, you have to ask yourself, what's the aperture? What's the aperture bias? And what other apertures do we have? So in our own incident response data, we're seeing a gentle softening in the amount of ransomware engagements. As they get smaller, more people are treating them as IT recovery efforts. Law enforcement are seeing it pretty much steady with maybe a little bit of growth. And we all have to keep challenging ourselves to understand that every single statistic here is biased in one way or another in helping understand this landscape. So more statistics, and this is from our own observations from our instant response engagements. These are the top 3 ways in. Vulnerable internet-facing appliances, not 0 days, end days, credential replay or brute forcing, and then commodity malware and loaders. And over the period of monitoring for this report, which is 12 months up until the end of June this year, we had roughly a third scan exploit, roughly a third credential replay, and a little over 10% on commodity malware. And these are interesting initial infection vectors because these are things that most security teams should be able to deal with. They also tell us something interesting in terms of the words targeted versus opportunistic. People in the computer security industry very often want to keep talking about things as targeted, whereas in actual fact, an underinvestment in good controls, an underinvestment in multi-factor authentication, there's an underinvestment in various forms of security controls can make you more vulnerable to this stuff, because if we look at the physiology of these 3 main initial access vectors, there's no targeting in there. Scan and exploit is people scanning the internet, looking for vulnerable internet-facing infrastructure. There's no target selection there. Credential replay, you could argue there's some implicit target selection because how people obtain credentials, but again, it's fundamentally untargeted. And then commodity malware is essentially the same. So the kind of victims that we see are appearing because of a lack of strength of their control frameworks put more positively, put more differently, you can still stop ransomware by getting the security basics right. I guess here's a couple of just other observations before I move on to hostile state actors. So what is the side effect of having vulnerable internet-facing infrastructure as a principal initial infection vector for multiple groups? Well, what it is that you find multiple ransomware gangs on the same victim at the same time. It doesn't happen every month, but I would say it's probably happening with us about once a quarter. We even had one incident where one gang got in there first, did their encryption event, and another one started to negotiate in bad faith with the first ransomware group, which is obviously pretty messy. I don't have a slide on it, but info stealers, the rise in info stealers is a big thing that's potentially fueling the lower end of the ransomware market. And Aidan has an on-demand session on info stealers. And then we have phishing evolving. The last couple of weeks, the news has been dominated by phishing links in Teams and phishing links with QR codes. Someone actually sent me one with a QR code on Friday, but I definitely wasn't daft enough to click on it. So if we move on from ransomware, general fraud, BEC, general fraud, CEO fraud is a massive concern. In some ways, this might give the bad guys more money than ransomware for less effort. So if we look at the stats from the IC3 report that the FBI put out, they were reporting $2.7 billion in losses for business email compromise, invoice redirection scams, versus 34.3 million in ransomware. Now, that lower stat, I don't believe. I'm sure there's aperture bias there. And obviously, as I say on the slide, guess which one of these crime types is the one where the FBI has processing systems to recover victim losses? So there's a real incentive for reporting a fraud attempt because you might get your money back, where there's much less incentive for reporting ransomware. So I don't particularly trust the lower figure, but still, there's 2 orders of magnitude different there. And later on, Rafe is going to cover CEO fraud with a couple of real-life examples, which should make for very interesting viewing. Okay, hostile state actors. What can we say about hostile state actors? Well, their whiteboards haven't changed. The national security priorities of the big ones of Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, they haven't changed much. I guess North Korea is mainly criminal money-making, actually. But it was interesting for the team to see last month. It felt like we're suddenly going back 5 years, where we had Russians compromising swathes of routers, more than 100 routers, setting up GRE tunnels and then spanning traffic, copying the traffic out through the tunnel to observe what was going in and out of a victim organization. So obviously they were well known for doing that 4 or 5 years ago. It's interesting to see that they're still up to badness like this. There's some interesting attribution for the pattern of life of this bad guy here. And again, there's a session that Rafe is doing on router compromises, what that means for man on the side and other forms of compromise that's in the on-demand sessions that you can get to in the portal. We also have an evolution here involving routers for China. So there's maybe 4 dimensions of the evolution of Chinese threat actor behavior. Some of you who've been tracking China for a while will say, yes, some of these things, Don, are definitely an evolution. They're definitely climate change because they've been around for a decade. Some are newer. I guess one of the newer ones that's certainly exercising lots of people's minds at the moment is Chinese covert networks, as I say, whether they're VPNs, whether they're networks of compromised machines, whether they're networks of compromised, in this case, SOHO routers, that are allowing them to hide their first hop and have an in-country first hop for their C2. So this is just one example. It's Bronze President with compromised router firmware. And you can see just a wee example of the tips that we use to inform our customers there. So that's the first dimension of change for China, that they're changing where they're coming from in terms of the infrastructure that touches victims, to make it harder for lots of people to see. Second evolution, which is half an evolution, half not, is that they are jumping onto edge devices, Manage Engine, Pulse VPN, you name it. We're all familiar with the usual suspects. We had some PRTG, MRTG servers that were used in the Bronze Silhouette campaigns as well. But in this case, it's Manage Engines compromised, base64 encoded text is pasted in. They use cert util to decode the base64. They write that onto a mounted network share, which happens to be an IIS server, and bingo, they've got a web shell. Back 30 years ago when I started this, edge devices were where we were monitoring. Now everyone's monitoring the endpoint. It is really important to keep monitoring your edge as well, because the bad guys know all the endpoints are monitored. And in this case, this is a Brunselet example, living off the land, using native tools so that you are either not tripping up your EDR tools, or you are issuing commands that are in the gray zone between legitimate systems administration use or malicious threat actor use, where it isn't a binary 0-1 decision as to whether that activity is seen as malicious, and that's kind of costly to monitor and triage. But classic Active Directory dumping here. So you've got the Chinese changing where they're coming from, hitting edge devices, using living off the land tactics as they've been doing for quite some time, and then finally just living in the cloud. So this is an incident response case from actually October last year, where an Azure application was set up which had read any mailbox and impersonate any user privileges. The net effect of that being that the only trace of those credentials, the tokens that were used there, being used would be the now infamous mail access items log that Microsoft had to make available to E3 people, a pure audit log being made available to try and identify nefarious use. So very clever, stealthy creation of something where an organization was compromised. They already had domain admin, but they did this deliberately so they wouldn't be observed, that they could get long-term stealthy access in the cloud without actually touching the enterprise itself. And this is the sort of thing, and this will be touched on by Joshua, but other things similar to this will be discussed in the panel session with Clay, Joshua, and Nestori later. And obviously there's an advisory there from the US government on using that mail access items. So if I kind of pause, this is abuse of authentication systems fundamentally, and abuse of trust. And the Chinese were doing this a long time ago. So back in 2014, we were working with an NGO where there was a Chinese group had infiltrated them for a long time. And what they were doing was putting in an authentication bypass into their core Active Directory using this DLL, and you can see the parameter there looks a bit like a password hash, which is what it was. And this was very neat. At the time when we published on it, lots of people came and asked us about it because they were like, this is quite cool, we've not seen it before. We worked with Tom Brewster at Forbes. He put out an article on it, and then 24 hours later, Ben Delpy added skeleton key mode to Mimikatz, and I had to ask myself, did we do the right thing publishing this thing? But this is just to give you a historical timeline there on the Chinese using stealthy tactics to subvert authentication systems. And not just the Chinese. Russia has been doing it for a long time too. So obviously, there's all of the Bitly URLs, the phishing campaigns that we were tracking in real time at the time that Hillary for America and the DNC were targeted by Our Twilight in our language, Fancy Bear in others. And those mail domains were all hosted on Google at the time. And what the bad guys did is man in the middle those authentication and cut persistent OAuth tokens, which then meant that they could use those persistent OAuth tokens to just continue to read email, even if someone had changed their password. So we kind of hinted at that quite strongly in that historic blog post. So Andrew Durand from Ping, I think, said this over a decade ago. Identity is, of course, the new perimeter, and identity systems are the things that defend us. And then a few things happened recently that remind me of this. So who remembers LulzSec? Who remembers 2 or 3 months of general chaos where a small group of fairly talented individuals managed to compromise some very, very big organizations? And the fun moment where they were able to tweet, "We have joy, we have fun, we have Rupert Murdoch's son," and they put out a fake news story saying that Rupert Murdoch was dead. And then a combination of smart technical capabilities and extremely smart social engineering, resulting in an amazing story of HB Gallery Federal and how they got in and compromised that organization. And at the time, that was a warning, because you had a very small number of motivated people who were able to do some quite nefarious things. And more recently, we've had Lapsus, and Lapsus have hit NVIDIA, Rockstar North, BT, EE, Microsoft, others. Two of the people in the Lapsus group have been prosecuted in the UK, so a lot of this is now much more out in the open than it was. And we have the same situation here. We have the same situation where we've got a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old who have, through social engineering, through a really clever understanding of authentication systems technically, how to subvert them, through SIM swapping, so persuading people in call centers to reassign different cell phone numbers, managing to compromise some of the authentication substrates and some of the largest organizations in the world, and it's two teenagers. So the US government put out this document. I don't necessarily agree with all of the recommendations, but it's an excellent document. And in it, it has this comment. If richly resourced cybersecurity programs were so easily breached by a loosely organized threat actor group, which included several juveniles, how can organizations expect their programs to perform against well-resourced cybercrime syndicates and nation-state actors? Well, I don't normally like to do this sort of the doom and fear, uncertainty and doubt sort of presentations. I like to focus on how we can fix things. But there is a warning here for all of us where probably the only reason there isn't more cyber badness out there is there's not more people doing it because a small, talented group of teenagers managed to compromise some of the most impressive organizations in the world, and we should all take that as a message that we've all got to get better at what we do. So with that, I'll pass you back to the very capable hands of Sarah.
Thank you so much, Don. What a way to kickstart this show, right? Really appreciate some of your insights. And we've got just so much more, so yeah,
we have a lot, yes. Yeah.
Well, let's move on then. Brilliant opening keynote, of course, to kickstart the show.